Good evening, welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. Well, it's not a late night rant, but I am mourning the loss of something that has now become so prevalent in our society that it's not okay to be different, and that we're all rushing around trying to say that we're all the same. And actually, we're not all the same. I remember, in my childhood, I can remember where people from different nations were allowed to be different, and that was okay. But there was no emphasis on trying to make everybody the same. And now it seems like we're working very hard at making everybody the same. So if you go to another country, instead of having the food of that country, it's all the same, isn't it? It's McDonald's is everywhere, and the idea that McDonald's came out with, that became almost like a blueprint for life on planet Earth, was that no matter where you went to in the world, if it had a McDonald's, it was, once you walked in the doors, apart from the people who served you, it was exactly the same as any other McDonald's. So that became like a formula for how things are. Whereas when I was a kid, everybody was different, and as I said, it was allowed. I lived in a small, not a small town, an industrial town. I lived in a small locality, poor locality. I'm not proud of that, but I'm not ashamed of it. It just was. As far as I'm concerned, Monty Python completely ruined the telling of sad stories. If you heard their skit where a group of them all sat round and talked about their sad beginnings, and finally they were living in shoeboxes because they'd all had such a terrible time. I didn't have a terrible time. I can remember my parents going through terrible times, but I was a kid, and I didn't understand that we were very poor. I knew that we didn't have great food. I knew that we had fish and chips, and that seemed fine to me, even if we had it almost every night. Well, that's how we lived. And we didn't have a bathroom. We had a long tin bath, and the water had to be boiled up and shared, and depending on your status in the family, you might be way down the line and bathing in mud, it seemed. But that was our life, and we were different. Someone from the north of England was different to someone from the south. Because we ate poor, we had fillers. We didn't have, I was born at the start of the Second World War, and I remember that the food, certain kinds of food, were rationed. We used to have stamps. We would have a ration book with stamps in it, but mainly we lived fish and chips and very basic food, because we just didn't have it. We used to, occasionally we would eat horse meat. We would also eat rabbit. Did I think that I was deprived because of that? No, I didn't know that I was being deprived because that was our life. I can remember living in areas where it was street after street after street. In Hume, I lived in Cowsby Street. I did have one subscriber that used to check up on the things that I said. I lived for a part of my very early life in a tiny little street called Wellington Grove, and we moved from Wellington Grove and we went to Tamworth Street, which was a bigger house. Just a minute, I've got to ask my wife, honey, you're roaming around like a ghost in the background while I'm trying to do a video.
Sorry.
Is there a reason for that?
Where's the charger, Han?
The
Here.
what?
The charger.
Here's a charger.
Yeah, that one.
Why don't you just speak?
They
Here.
try to find it without
Here.
disturbing you. Sorry.
And she's walking around and thinking that she's not disturbing me. Such is Filipino. You see, they're different. And they're still allowed to be different. They're determinedly different. Now, when we moved into Tamworth Street, and as I said, I did have a subscriber friend who used to say, hey, I found it. I found Tamworth Street, and we lived close to Stretford Road. And we had a different life. I see the way that children live here, and although it's a difference between living in the city, which is where I lived, and living in the country, which is where Filipino kids live, but I see them, and you know, when you guys are looking in on these videos and you're living in usually very often a very nice house, which is a mansion by Filipino standards. Bearing in mind, I'm not saying that all Filipinos are in need or less fortunate and all of those poverty-stricken, all of those phrases. I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that life is so much simpler here in the province, and it applied also to people who lived in the country in the UK as well, though I was not familiar with people who lived in the country really. And so, but then there was an area near Cowsby Street which, if we crossed the road, went through the recreation park, we would enter a poorer neighbourhood. Now this is ironic, isn't it? I'm telling you what a poor upbringing I had, and yet we had the people who came from other countries, and they were immigrants, and they were coloured, they were black, and they lived very poorly, but they had a style about them. People from, say, Trinidad, people from places that the UK government had imported them as workers, and they came, and this has happened in almost every country. In America they've imported, they have Mexican workers, and the Mexicans come, and they to a large extent don't enjoy an abundant life, but they come and they work hard and they send their money home. And this is what used to happen in the UK, is that you would have people come and they would integrate to an extent into the workforce, but they didn't really integrate socially. My mother, if anybody was of a coloured skin, my mother would call them a blackie. Now, if I'm going to talk about things which are politically incorrect, well, sorry, but back then things were, compared to now, politically incorrect. So she would call them blackies. For me, from my childhood, from my child perspective, I thought that they were incredible, because they had what I've now learned in retrospect, because I've been reading about how the Irish and a lot of people of different cultures went to New York, and they used to dress in what in what were called then zoot suits, and they would be very flamboyant. They would have very baggy trousers that were pegged at the ankle, and they had their own style, and I loved that because they were different and they celebrated their difference. Now it's that we're all trying as if to be the same. Now in the music industry, and if I wander around a lot, well, it's going to be that kind of video. In the music industry, we went through a huge period where black people, black Americans, tried to be white because that was the pressure. And then I remember watching in real time, I remember watching an interview with, I think it was between Michael Parkinson, who was a very popular man then, whether he's still there I don't know, this is the UK, and he interviewed, I saw a couple of interviews which really marked me. I saw Muhammad Ali, and he came and he was interviewed, and of course Muhammad Ali gained his chance to show that he was a great fighter by being great with his mouth, and that was when he was the one that talked about how beautiful he was. Look at me, I'm beautiful, and look at him, he's got a broken nose, and he was a great fighter. Now he was interviewed by Michael Parkinson, and he was outrageous for them. He was outrageously outspoken about black and white. He was racist according to present standards. Now you got to be careful whether you say that someone's black. Oh, you're racist, I see. So you can't even make a reference to someone, which is a pity, isn't it? Because we are different. We are different. When I went to America first, I didn't realize how different I was compared to Americans, because I'm fairly quietly spoken most of the time, and Americans are not. Now, does that mean that if you talk to someone from the UK, for them, they'll be talking about Americans being loud? Well, they're loud, aren't they? Yeah. And compared to the UK, Americans are loud, generally speaking, even though you've got to admit that generalities don't really work. Not all. They generally don't generally work, okay? So I came to America, and now suddenly the interpretation on the fact that I spoke quietly was that I had no confidence and didn't know anything. And that was difficult. Even, I mentioned this the other night on a video, how my then grown-up daughter got annoyed with me because I spoke quietly. Dad, speak louder. We were in the bank. Speak louder. We don't celebrate people being different, and that's what we should do. And I notice this with not Americans, foreigners coming over here. Instead of celebrating the fact that the Filipinos are different, you find that they criticize that. Filipinos are not confrontational. It's not part of we've spoke about this many times, it's not part of the culture to be confrontational. They're much more tolerant of differences. They do not feel that they're being a victim if they give way to something. Whereas in one of my more jaded moments in America, I made the statement that in America, such as the education system and the way that it works growing up, humility is a four-letter word. Yes, well, maybe the joke doesn't travel too well. But I notice many things of how people, they ridge up, their shoulders go up and they get defensive and offensive if you indicate that they are different to you, because for some strange reason the negativity takes over and they assume that you are saying that they are less than you. I went into for instance, I went into a motor parts, spare parts place, an aftermarket thing, and this was in America, and I spoke to, it was a black guy who was serving me, and I was trying to explain to him something that I didn't know how Americans refer to this. What did they call it? I often go in now to the Philippines and I don't know. I went in and asked for string. What? String? You know, and string, and I do all the mime. The string, you tie it together and pull, and none of that worked. Finally, I learned that it's called straw. Now, if I'm going to do negative comparisons, why the hell did they call string straw? That's stupid. You see, when I went in to try to get a motor part, I was trying to explain to him, for me, when you have the spark plug leads, in the UK they would call those HT leads, high tension, I think, leads. But in America they don't call them that. So when I asked for HT leads, the man looked at me. Now, maybe he'd already made up his mind that the way that I spoke as an English person was in some way trying to be superior. And I said, look, HT leads described what they did, the plugs, and I refused to believe. I said, look, can you help me out here? I'm speaking English and you're speaking American. That didn't gain me any points at all, because he assumed that I was saying that this difference I was pointing out made him the lesser. And I gave this example to some other Americans, and they said, oh yeah, that wouldn't do it. But another friend of mine who was American always laughed and said, we share everything but a common language. Between the English and American, we share everything but a common language. And that used to arise a lot. Now, my mother would always see differences between us, as in our family, and anybody who was culturally, racially different. But she didn't think that that was a bad thing. She thought that was a wonderful thing. So the Italians were different, the French were different, the Germans were different. All of these people, all different. And when you go back then, before there was mass immigration from all of these cultures, crossing this way and that way. And now, I remember one time in England when I was in London and I was trying to find something, and I asked for directions, and I asked 4 or 5 people before I found anyone who spoke English in London, in the UK. So back then I like to think that we celebrated the difference between people and where they come from. And that was the wonderful thing. We started to get, well, one of the first ethnic differences that I noticed of people coming to the UK and integrating into the business community, that is providing a service, was a Chinese laundry. When we were doing quite well and my father was employed, we used to take our bed sheets and dress shirts, my father's dress shirts. My father used to wear shirts which had no collar, and he used to have starched collars that went on with a stud in the front and the back, and he would put his tie on, and they were starched to a razor's edge. How he ever dressed that way, I'll never know. But that was how he dressed. And I used to take those articles of clothing, and I would take them to the Chinese restaurant. Not the Chinese restaurant, the Chinese laundry. The Chinese laundry was always this place of really incredible mystery. It was a tiny, tiny little shop, and there was like a trapdoor that was maybe this big. And when I went in, I sounded a bell, or there was a bell on the door, either way. I would go in, and then I would wait, and it all seemed very dark and black as a little kid. And this would be the counter, and I would put the stuff on the counter, and then a very, very strict looking Chinese woman came, who for me at that age and where I was in learning about the world was almost like someone from another planet. And she spoke very, very little English, and there was very little English needed. I would hand her the dirty laundry. She would give me a tag. And back then they used to write with an indelible pen. They would write a little code, which meant that it was your laundry, didn't get mixed up with anybody else's. And it came back beautiful. The sheets, you used to peel them because they were so heavily, they were washed perfectly white, and they would be so heavily starched that if you dropped them on the floor, they made a clunking sound. We used to love the idea of peeling the sheets and putting them onto the bed, and it would feel so good to get into those freshly starched sheets. And we celebrated, we embraced the fact that the Chinese were so incredibly different. I do remember actually that in my travels in China, I do remember that I went to one particular town, and they were not used to seeing, can you believe this, that there's a place in the world where they're not used to seeing foreigners. Probably a foreigner that looked like me. And children followed us. And finally we turned, and I smiled at the children and said hello. And I could see in the face of any child that he or she didn't know how to process what they were seeing. This strange person, strange looking, strange eyes, strange skin tone, didn't know how to do it. But they celebrated, they embraced the idea that I was different and that it was okay. So I'm really trying, I guess, in this another long-winded talk, trying to get a point over of why can't we get back to celebrating the difference between all of us, instead of saying we're all the same. We're not all the same. and that's okay. So thanks for listening to my wandering about tonight, all over the place, haven't I? Which I can't apologise for, because I guess in a way that's what makes me different to, well, the next person. So bye for now. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe if you can comment. If not, you can always make a comment by finding us on Facebook. Bye for now.